All the windows and doors of Oakshade's makeshift ballroom were open to the night air, but a polka, a waltz, and a reel, all with Sam Etheridge, were enough to put Annalee into the chairs with the dowagers and married ladies for a rest. She flopped down indecorously next to Rebecca and unfolded her fan. "Tired already?" Rebecca teased. "Just need to breathe for a minute. I can't stand these stays." She could feel the whalebone in the corset as she held her abdomen to ease the pain in her side. Rebecca shook her head and turned back to watch the dancing. A few moments later, she rose and moved quickly for the door. Annalee followed her into the empty kitchen and closed the door against the sound of Shenandoah. Rebecca's hacking punctuated the muffled fiddle with an erratic, grating accompaniment. John bolted into the room seconds after them and came to Rebecca's side as Annalee reached in a drawer for a towel and then handed it to him. He held it close to Rebecca's face until she took it and pushed it to her mouth. When finally the coughing stopped, she brought it away from her face and looked into it. The blood spot was a few inches round, and in the middle of it was a tiny bit of bloody tissue. Rebecca stared at it a moment, then folded the towel over and wiped her mouth. "Let's go upstairs," John whispered after a moment. Annalee helped John support Rebecca's arms while they walked to the stairs. When they reached the bottom step, John turned to her. "I'll take her from here," he said. Annalee started to protest, but John smiled his firmness in the stance and left her staring after them. Teague sat in the most inconspicuous corner of the parlor, only half listening to the chatter in the room and the tunes playing at the other side of the house. The people seemed oblivious to the fact that a Confederate retreat was not the only result of 3 days at Gettysburg. The battle had also brought the deaths and suffering of countless men. Not one of the people surrounding him in the parlor was without a son, brother, or at least a cousin, who had been under what was sure to be some of the worst fire of the war. Yet Teague couldn't condemn them. Perhaps they knew in their hearts that their time of mourning would come at daybreak, so that they should use the night's festivities to quell that knowledge. Teague closed his eyes. He was momentarily tempted to pray for his own brother's safety, but thought better of the supplication to God, and opened his eyes at the sound of Joseph Etheridge's ringing voice. "I have in this hat the name of every person in this room," Etheridge said to the 20 or so people assembled. "I propose a contest among those fortunate few whose names are drawn from the hat. A contest of talent in which they will perform at our whim feats of entertainment so grand we would charge admission on any other occasion. What do you say?" "That's some billing to live up to, Joe," Mr. Brighton laughed. "You're not likely to get a first-rate show out of me, but I'm willing to try if everyone else is." Sounds of assent topped the few sounds of dissent, so Etheridge rifled through the slips of paper in his hat. He drew his own name. "I didn't mix it up enough. Let me pick again," he teased. An uproar of baiting met his statement, and he held up his hands in defeat. "What shall I do, then?" The names of various activities jumbled as several people called them out at once, and Joseph shook his head in confusion. "Wait a minute. I'll write down some things, and we can draw what you're going to do as well," Mr. Brighton said. After a minute he tousled some papers in his own hat and drew one. "Charades." Etheridge leaned against the wall to think for a minute. Teague took this opportunity to make ready to leave the room before his own name might come up. He stopped in the act of reaching for his crutches, though, when he glanced through the doorway to the stairs in the darkened hall. Annalee was standing at the bottom and staring up at Dr. and Mrs. DePriest's ascent. When they were out of sight, she leaned her arm on the banister and let her head rest in her hand. Teague placed his crutches back against the wall and watched her. After a few moments, she straightened up and took a breath. The light from the parlor only partially illuminated her face, but Teague could see her frown when she glanced toward the sound of music. She wiped her eyes and walked toward the parlor. Teague switched his gaze to Joe Etheridge's charade of what he might have guessed was an attempt at Daniel in the lion's den, but he kept Annalee's approach in the corner of his eye. As she entered the room, she forced a smile and sat on one of the sofas beside Amanda Etheridge and across from Teague. Someone finally called out the answer to Etheridge's antics, and he sat down. He handed the hat to his wife and nodded for her to draw a name. Captain Scott?" Amanda said. Teague started shaking his head, but Brighton pulled a slip of paper out of his own hat. "Sing us a song." "I'll pass." "Can't pass, Cap," Brighton said as he clapped him on the back. "Rules of the game, you know." "But—" "Come on, Captain. Nobody here bites. At least I don't think so." Joseph raised a suspicious eyebrow at one of Mr. Brighton's sons. "I'll sing with you," Annalee offered. "That'll get them back for making you stand up." "A duet, then," Joseph said. "Shall we give 'em a song?" "Long, long ago is nice," Amanda said. "That's what they'll do, dear wife," Joseph replied. Teague sighed as Annalee smiled her encouragement to him. "I insist," she said. "I'll take the first verse, you do the second, and we'll try it together on the third." Teague nodded as he stood and positioned his crutches beneath his arms. Annalee cleared her throat, gave a look of apology to the group, then began in her customary half-key off style. "Tell me the tales that to me were so dear, long, long ago, long, long ago. Sing me the songs I delighted to hear, long, long ago, long, long ago. Now you are come, my grief is removed." Teague could barely keep from wincing as she muddled through the refrain, changing keys as she went, trying unsuccessfully to find the correct one. He swallowed as his turn came up, and he kept his eyes on the floor as he sang. "Do you remember the path where we met, long, long ago, long, long ago? Ah, yes, you told me ne'er would forget, long, long ago, long, long ago. Then to all others my smile you preferred, love when you spoke gave a charm to each word. Still my heart treasures the praises I heard, long, long ago, long ago." He could feel Annalee's slack-jawed gaze at his face. He knew he had a strong, sonorous voice, and he flushed at the idea that he was showing her up. He shut his eyes as he started the third verse. "Though by your kindness my fond hopes were raised, long, long—" Teague stopped and looked down at Annalee. "You're not singing." "You didn't tell me you could sing." Her mouth was still partially opened. Teague would have shifted his weight guiltily from one foot to the other if he could. Before he could say anything, Annalee continued. "I was acting the fool up here," she smiled. Teague couldn't meet her stare. "You did insist," he mumbled. Mr. Brighton guffawed at the statement, and several others in the room joined in at the mere sound of his mirth. Teague saw from the corner of his down-turned eyes that Annalee's smile had transformed to a forced one again.